All right, today we're going to talk a little bit about religious liberty um, and the two parts of the First Amendment, really. The first few slides there, I give you kind of a background towards religious liberty and where it comes from. Um, I'm one of those, I don't think I mentioned this in the last video about free speech, but that the First Amendment is first for a reason. If you think about the sort of the pilgrim mindset, I mean, two groups of British subjects, English subjects, came here in the 1600s. One were religious pilgrims. The word pilgrim has a religious connotation to it. They were separatists, Congregationalists, Puritans, proto-Baptists in many cases, coming here basically just to get away from the Church of England and the King of England. And of course, they still had to come under his authority to form colonies. And then you have in the Virginia side, you have sort of the property, the mercantile merchant. So you think about life, which bridges both of those: liberty of conscience, freedom to believe or not believe, and then property, life, liberty, and property. You can see those in sort of the original thing. So those are our core values. And I think it's not accidental, though it's a little weird that the text puts free speech and free press first, because really, if you look at the First Amendment, the text of it, religious liberty comes first, then comes free speech. If you don't have religious liberty, you can't have free speech, right? Why? Because religious liberty, freedom of conscience, is freedom to believe whatever you want, however you want. Out of that flows your views on politics and art and all of that. Now you might say, well, I don't have any religious beliefs. I hate to tell you this, but that is in fact a religious belief. So you're worshiping something or somebody, right? All of us are. So that's the first conscience. That's the core right. So insofar as those things are sliding in today's world, you see the other things slide with them, right? If you don't have the right to believe and express your belief reasonably, again, there's always limits on these rights. None of these rights are absolute in the sense of the government's not just going to let people sacrifice children on pyramids and burn people alive and all those kinds of things. Not legally, or those things could still happen, but they would be criminalized. Then from that, it's not accidental then that all of a sudden you get all of this. Well, you can't say that because it might hurt your feelings. You can't say this because it's blah, blah, blah. Or you can't write that or any of those kinds of things. So religious liberty is core to our rights. The Second Amendment is probably tied to the First Amendment in the sense that it protects the First, and it also protects the property rights, Third and Fourth Amendment. Fifth Amendment, eminent domain, and then Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, Eighth are the criminal justice amendments. You got to limit the government in that area as well, because freedom of conscience is a huge area where the government would want to limit its people, and so is property. Take it from people, and you can also, of course, take their liberty away in the criminal justice system. And so all that is sort of in the Bill of Rights. So today we're talking about religious liberty. So as with a lot of these rights, it's kind of a slow rollout. Even the Puritans, when they come here, it's pretty much religious liberty for me, but not for thee. So, for example, you're going to California Baptist University. I don't know how much you know about Baptists, but Baptists are the OG separation of church and state people. I mean, if your Baptist belief holds a lot of things you can put into that. We're not as creedal as, say, Catholics or Lutherans or those kinds of folks. But what we do hold to almost without fail, whether someone is quote unquote liberal or conservative theologically, is the total separation of church and state. That's to be. If you don't believe that, you are not a Baptist in my book. Right? That's how fundamental it is. So all that to say that you're going to see a lot of these leaders in what will become the United States version of separation church and state and free exercise of religion come not only from Baptists, because there are Presbyterians and Lutherans and Catholics and all sorts of people in the founding of the country who are in favor of free religion, free speech, free exercise. Atheists as well, if you think about Tom Paine and deists like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson. So there's a wide swath of people who believe in religious liberty. But the first step in that was what's called toleration. Toleration is you can worship how you want. I'm still going to make you pay taxes to pay the church, state church, or colonial church. So the first states, Congregationalist is a religion or denomination. You'll see those in Connecticut, Massachusetts. The Baptists are in Rhode Island. Quakers, Pennsylvania. Anglican Church, which then becomes American Episcopalian Church, is the state church or colonial church of Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia. Maryland is a Catholic colony under Queen Mary. She's chartered. So to be the governor of Maryland, you'd have to be a mass attending, tithe paying Catholic, just like you'd have to be a tithe paying, church attending Congregationalist to be the governor of Massachusetts back in the 1600s, early 1700s. Baptists don't want any of that, right? So they tend to get punished, put in jail. So, but toleration acts are the beginning of, and I've given you the text of an earlier one there to show you on that. And that's slide. Sorry, I hit the wrong button here. Oh my goodness, close. So slide 2, rather, where it says background, and then slide 3, you get the Maryland Toleration Act, which is one of the first to do that. Now, they didn't come out of this necessarily out of some dictatorial thing. So Isaiah 49:23 there on slide 3, and you look at it, kings were, quote, foster fathers and queens were to be nursing mothers. So in today's world, we tend to think of, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Castro, Kim Jong-un, etc. British kings weren't like that necessarily. French kings, maybe, but British kings, not so much. And kings in general tended to, on the good side of things, see themselves as the sort of father and mothers, nurses, queens rather, of their country. In other words, I love my people like a parent loves his children, right? Like Christ loved the church. So embedded in that was his obligation. Well, as you might imagine, though, parents, the American government's not my father. It's not even my Uncle Sam. And so in America, we tended to separate from that. And one of the ways to do that is to disestablish religion. That's what the Establishment Clause refers to. It's the disestablishment of a state church, not religion in general. So the separation of church and state has become a bloody mess where the modern Americans tend to think, religion is Christianity. No, establishment of a church refers to the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, the Southern Baptist, the American Baptist, the Northern Baptist, Missouri Synod Lutheran, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are established state-run church, or could be established state-run churches. Church is not Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Mormonism, etc. Right? If they become officially recognized state churches and then receive money from, and I mean direct payments too, like in England, if you're a pastor there, you get the Church of England, you get a salary from the taxes of the people. Even though Britain is a godless country in some ways now, that the church attendance is 1% of the population. Even if you're a Hindu from Pakistan, you live in England, you're paying taxes which go to the Church of England. I mean, we don't do that here in these United States, and that's kind of part of the disestablishment of religion. Isaac Backus is a Southern Baptist, or a Baptist preacher rather, from the South, from Massachusetts. He says, when church and state are separate, the effects are happy. They do not at all interfere with each other, but where they have been confounded together, no tongue nor pen can fully describe the mischiefs that have ensued. Again, so basically, it's kind of a riff on what Martin Luther called two kingdoms. The pastor has the authority over his flock in spiritual matters, so punishing things like adultery and lying and all of that. In general, the moral health of his flock, and then the governor, the magistrate, the government would have the power of the sword from Romans 13 to then physically punish people for violations of the civil law, which might overlap into moral if you think about fraud and perjury and Obviously, adultery could refer to sex crimes and things that are just of a more virulent or criminal nature, et cetera, et cetera. And that they would sort of, as much as possible, never those two wouldn't really overlap into each other. In other words, it's not the government's job to punish me for blasphemy. It's my pastor's job to come to me and say, hey, Troy, you shouldn't say that or believe that. This is wrong, and this is why it's wrong. It's not the Riverside County Sheriff's Department or the California Department of Justice or the U.S. Department of Justice's job to monitor my beliefs or the state of my soul, if you will. So that's kind of where that comes from, or one of the sources of where that comes from. John Leland was a pastor, a Baptist minister, also in Virginia, and then also later in Massachusetts, I believe, or Connecticut. And again, for religious liberty. And I mean total religious liberty. These people were like, look, if you bring in, they would use the word Turks back then for Muslims, but if you bring in Muslims, let the Muslims worship however they want. If you bring in Jews, let Jews come in and worship however they want. Let them build their synagogues, let them blah, blah, blah. If you're an atheist, be an atheist, right? We just want you to have the same rights legally as everybody else under the Constitution, and then worship how you see fit. So most Baptists especially, but religious liberty types in those days were especially just egalitarian to some degree in that. Still believe that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, but also if you don't want to believe in Jesus, I can't make you at the point of the sword believe in Jesus, right? That's the idea here, that sure, I believe my religion is the best, but I can't by government force you to believe something that you don't really believe. One, that wouldn't be good for your soul, right? So as an evangelical tool, that would be bad. If I force a belief on you, you're still probably not a sincere believer. And then also you won't then try to coerce me to believe what I want to believe. And so therefore I have the freedom to practice my religion. That's the free exercise clause. And everybody else has the right to practice their religion. Now, moving ahead to slides. So the two clauses in, one's called the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Now, when this was not a very controversial language when the founding went on. Establishment literally just meant an established state or government church, meaning government pays for the church. So the state then has a say in what goes on in the church. So if you think about a lot of European countries, even still, there's an official Lutheran Church of Norway. There's an official Lutheran Church of Sweden. There's the Church of England in England. There's the official Church of Germany, which is both Catholic and Lutheran. Now, most of the people in those countries don't actually attend those churches. As I said, church attendance in those countries is way down to negligible amounts, right? They're godless countries in many ways. Nevertheless, there's still, so if the church comes out and has something that it wants to say about abortion or gay marriage or a war or any policy, well, the church has a hard time having that freedom when the government says, hey, look, we fund X amount of dollars of your budget and we pay your salary. Right, you can see that. By the same token, the danger back in the day was the other way. The church might say, look, if you think about the Crusades, would be the sort of most extreme version of it. Hey, look, the Pope wants to free the Holy Land, and we want you to blah, blah, blah. So there's dangers both ways. The church can have too much control over the state, and the state can have too much control over the church. The Establishment Clause is designed to sort of remove that. Now, so establishment didn't mean Christianity, Buddhism, religion, as I said, just sort of religion in general. It meant an official church of the state, of the government. The Establishment Clause says Congress shall not basically form a church, a national church. So that's the Establishment Clause. So the courts, now I think one of the problems too is the justices in society have secularized. Most of them have no idea really what that means. They have no idea. A lot of justices, now some of them are Catholic and they go to Mass and all that. But it's been a long time since we've had someone who's a Baptist, a Presbyterian, or whatever be in the Supreme Court. A lot of our elites nowadays don't really go to church on a regular basis. They have no idea what a church is, really. They just think church. They think, oh, Christianity. On one sense, yes, but on the other sense, on the day-to-day happenings of a church. So when they see like, oh my gosh, this school is having a church club and it's a Christian club on campus, they can't do that. Yes, they can actually. Now you got to follow the rules, right? You got to fill out the permit. You got to pay for cleanup. You got to clean up your mess. If it's Saturday, you got to pay the janitor overtime to come. You still have to pay for those are called reasonable regulations, right? So if you go to a large church, I go to a church here in Riverside called the Grove. It's a large church. So on Sunday, there's lots of traffic problems. So what do? We pay extra for police to come out in overtime to control traffic. Why? Well, we want to be good neighbors. We don't want car accidents. We don't want, traffic. We want to be the least amount of burdensome on our neighbors as possible in the neighborhood, right? We still have to pay our employees by the hour. We have to provide them benefits. We have to give them lunch hours. We have to follow environmental regulations. Obviously, we can't just burn trash in the back. You know what I mean? So you can have those kind of reasonable regulations on churches, right? Now, the government can't tell us when to worship, how to worship. Now, again, they can say, okay, so for example, during COVID, we have a huge outdoor area. So, okay, you don't want us to meet indoors? Fine, we'll meet outdoors. We got a huge lawn. Now, there are then city regulations. And again, we want to be good neighbors. So we're not going to have a midnight service with music blaring. There's houses like right there, right? So what? Well, in the daylight hours, you can have service at regular times. And we still probably keep the music down and keep the sound down. But after sunlight hours, blah, 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 right? But then you can't have after certain nighttime hours because of noise. So those aren't against the church. Those are general regulations. You can have those, right? So establishment clause, you don't see cases for the establishment clause until almost the 1900s because it's really just not a controversy. And then as we diversify, especially in the late 19th century, you have more and more people who don't believe. You have more and more immigrants coming in from a variety of places. So now you're bringing in a lot more Catholics from Ireland, and you've got them from Mexico. Now you got a lot of immigration from from China and Japan. So they're bringing in Buddhism and Hinduism, and then you've got sort of a growing atheism. You've got obviously Orthodox coming in from Greece and places like that. So you get a really diversifying population, religiously speaking. So you don't have the sort of I won't say sameness because you had a pretty diverse population, quite frankly, even before then. So the incorporation then refers to incorporation. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. So each of these amendments get incorporated against the states. So there were some actually, into the early 1800s, some actual state churches. So for example, the Episcopal Church in Virginia was the state church in Virginia into the first decade or so of the 1800s, even after the First Amendment was passed. Why? Because remember, Congress shall make no law. It says nothing about Virginia shall make no law. The the Congregationalist Church, I believe, was in charge of Connecticut. I want to say until like 1830. I mean, it was pretty deep into the beginning of the country where Connecticut still had a state church. And then by the Civil War, most vestiges of that had disappeared out from the American landscape. And as new states were coming into the Union, they didn't have state churches. Congress wasn't going to approve that. So eventually they just kind of died out on their own. Eventually, the McCollum case here, so slide 9, establishment clause was incorporated to the states by the Supreme Court. So basically now they apply the Bill of Rights, at least in this area, to the states. So we've talked about incorporation a couple of weeks ago. This is one of those rights that's been there as well. So there would no longer be a state church of California, a state church of Texas or New Mexico or whatever that would be allowed. Most of the battles that come in to these things are how much is the state or is the state helping a church, and if so, how so? Because what you have is a lot of overlap. So, when I'll use my church again as an example. At the Grove, we built 4 homes basically tiny homes, I guess, are about 800 square foot, and they're there for transitional housing. So, well, the city has a problem. Most cities in California have some problem with homelessness and drug addiction and mental health issues and those kinds of things. So we want to do our part. So we built 4 homes on our campus that we maintain. They, of course, meet regulations of California related to fireproofing and no lead paint and asbestos and those kinds of things. So the state can put some regulations on the church, right? We got to build homes. We got to make them safe. By the same token, they help us with finding people to live in these homes, and we help the city. So there can be partnerships. So the separation of church and state thing never was meant to be a total separation at all. The founders, the churches were the original social safety net. If you were hungry, if you were poor, if you were sick, the church was the one that should have taken care of you. Quite frankly, they still should be doing that. As we pawned that off on the government more and more in the late 1800s, early 1900s, then you start to see this total separation idea. Or the founders were like, no, we can't have a just country without a just people. And the best way to have a just people is to have a religious people in general. So the Everson case, the sort of wall of separation of church and state, that's not even in the Constitution. That's from a letter Jefferson wrote. Basically, the wall of separation was to protect the church from the government, not the government from the church. And then this idea that government may not aid religion generally, that's pretty much not the case much anymore. But they can't favor, say, Christianity over Buddhism or Islam or whatever in terms of like social programs. If there's a synagogue program that helps drug addicts or is used in a rehabilitation sense during a probation program, the government can help fund that to some degree as well. Public displays, slide 13 and 14 and 15 and 16. There's been a lot of fighting over crosses and things like that. I really sometimes think, again, I hate to laugh at atheists, but they fight over such silly things, sadly, the cross doesn't mean what it should mean when it's used in memorials. But back in the day, yes, they put the cross there because they thought it was a Christian symbol. It is a Christian symbol, but in today's world, I'm not sure that many people look at the cross in battlefield cemeteries, and go, oh wow, Jesus Christ died for my sins. They should, if they see a cross, think that, I think, but that's not the intent of them. Usually, it's not even a statement on the religion of the person buried underneath, except they checked a box on their forms that said Christian. That wasn't even a sign of devotion so much as like, hey, what church do you go to? I go to a Methodist church. Okay, boom, Christian. And then when they die, they get killed in action. They don't test whether or not they were devout Christians or not. They just look at their forms and go, this guy was a Methodist. They have the service. They put a cross on it. So there's been a ton of lawsuits over things like 10 Commandments and crosses. As a general rule, the court tends to uphold those things as just memorial historical artifacts and not as sincere religious signs of devotion, right? The education has also been a lot of cases there. If you think about homeschool and private school education, things like school funds. Again, for the most part, so for some of you may be on what's called Cal Grant, for example, which is, for those of you not in California, it's a state, basically a grant program for California students of a certain socioeconomic status. And so some of that money comes to schools like Cal Baptist. A lot of it goes to Cal States. Texas had a grant when I was in college similar to that. I'm sure if you're another state, I think one of you is from Ohio, then your state probably has something like that also. Anyway, so some states, so Washington decided it was going to withhold, Washington State, those funds from Christian degrees, Bible degrees, or what they called, quote unquote, seminary degrees. So that's the Locke versus Davy case. So, hey, a state can, so they're not necessarily punishing degrees, but the state doesn't have to support those degrees either, right? I don't think that's a good decision by Washington, but the court held that was well within the people of Washington's rights to direct how their money is spent. They couldn't keep it probably from Seattle Pacific, say, for example, University in particular, but they can say, okay, if you're going to get state money, you'd have to be towards something that's nurse, teacher, cop, engineer, accountant, etc. So that's a perpetual fear in some states like this. It doesn't require you to withhold those funds, but you can withhold those funds. That kind of comes up all the time here. School prayer cases, for the most part, again, as long as the prayer is, as long as it's student led and voluntary, then, and not during the actual game time and not during actual school time. So you can have it sort of like meet at the pole, right, and pray before school or after school. They can't have Christian clubs meet, maybe during lunch or before class or after class or whatever. And of course, if you open up for a Christian club, you got to have a Jewish club and a Muslim club if they want. There's got to be student interest, student led, not paid for by the school, those kinds of things. So as long as the school's not subsidizing it. Content neutral is kind of the same way. And then starting inside 22 is free exercise. And free exercise is basically, again, how do you express your belief? So again, as with all these things, it's not an absolute right. So, they can't tell you not to believe certain things. They might be able to control how you express those things. So again, if you express, say, well, for whatever reason, this is a silly example, I have to express my faith by holding services on the 5 freeway at 5 p.m. every day. No. Right? I don't care if you sincerely hold that. We are not going to brick traffic on one of the busiest freeways in the United States so you can have your religious service. Take it off. Take it outside. Take it off the highway. That sort of thing, right? So public order, in our religion, we beat our children with hammer. Well, you can't do that. That's disgusting and it's wrong and it's criminal. And no, can't do that, right? So it's not an absolute right, in reasonable limits on these sort of things. So distinguishing between practice and belief. So the Reynolds case, and if we had more time, there's a whole slew of cases against the Mormons or by Mormons against the United States about trying to limit polygamy and the amount of money that the Mormon church and property that the Mormon church had back in the day. And all of it kind of tied to Utah becoming a state and all of that. But the distinction between practice and belief. Wisconsin versus Yoder. Yoder family were Amish. Amish, if you don't know, sort of live like it's 1699, right? They are sort of part of what's called an Anabaptist tradition. Sort of like pacifist, no government, and the Amish take it sort of to an extreme level. They just sort of no cars, no nothing, right? They own a lot of land. They will go to school, but the way they live, they're like, look, after 8th grade, we don't need school anymore. We have all we need to run our society after 8th grade. So the state wanted them to go to school, and the Amish were like, but this is part of our religious belief that we don't need to go to school after X amount of years. And the Supreme Court actually found for Yoder over Wisconsin. Now they have to go to school to 8th grade. They can go to school after if they wish, but they can basically drop out of the system at 8th grade or after 8th grade under the Yoder case. So the parents there of the case. And why Amish, not Mormons? I gave you a bunch of basically the polygamy case there, the Reynolds case. That's always been a crime. So if you think about these different artifacts from different constitutions here, from slide 26, 27, 28, 29, I gave you some portions of state constitutions, basically saying that as long as religion is peaceful and orderly. So basically the Amish are what? Kids should go to school. They do go to school, but the Amish are not violating the criminal laws of a state. Bigamy, polygamy is a violation of the criminal laws of a state. It's also just not something we do here in the West. It's always been a crime. It's always been outlawed. And so therefore the court basically says, okay, yes to the Amish, no to the Mormons. And then the Mormons gave up polygamy as one of their religious duties anyway. And so that, well, I don't know if that resolved it for all time, but for the meantime. Other cases here, you have the Jehovah's Witnesses. If you think about them soliciting door to door, soliciting doesn't necessarily mean selling a product. So they go door to door. So they can't be licensed to go door to door. Now, you as a private owner, if you put a sign that says no solicitors, you can keep people off your porch. Jehovah's Witnesses, Spectrum, AT&T, the True Green, whatever, True Long guys, any of those people. Same with a store. If you're running a store, you can say, hey, look, Jehovah's Witnesses, you can come here and eat, obviously, and buy, but you can't come here and stand outside my door and sell your religion outside my McDonald's, right? So you can limit that. But that's private ownership. The Watchtower Bible Tract Society, that's also the official name of the Jehovah's Witness Church. Again, you can't make them license. You can't license them or require them to buy a permit to talk about their religion. You can control where and when. So you can't go knocking on doors at 2 a.m, right? You can't stand in the middle of the street with a bullhorn and do that. You can't interrupt school services and all those kinds of things either. So there are some limits. And then that's the Prince versus Massachusetts case, which again, you can make your 9-year-old go to church. So there are child labor laws, right? You can't make your child work during school hours. You might be able to on Saturday or Sunday because they're your child, but the school, church. Now, the Yoder thing is what? They had a religious thing that said you have to do this or that, and they were still going to school to 8th grade. This is a 9-year-old girl, so her parents are taking her out of elementary school, and they're like, no, you got to have some education if you think about homeschooling and all that. And then, so really just religious practice. There's been some, the sincerity of belief for the last one, Ballard case, dealt about faith healing. People who got in trouble with those kinds of things got in trouble for committing tax fraud. So I believe that people can be healed. I don't know about faith healers that I see on TV, Benny Hinn and all those folks. Those guys would get in trouble if they say, if you give me money, I will build a church, and then they take that money and build a house for themselves. That's usually where those guys would get in trouble. Not because of the faith healing and whether or not it's true or not, because the government can't prove that or disprove it. And that's what's called a non-justiciable issue. But they get in trouble for basically fraud when they say, if you give me X amount of dollars to build a church or to print Bibles to send overseas, and then they spend 50% of that money on salary or whatever the number is, or on one of them got in trouble for building a 4-room doghouse with central air in the 80s. I mean, those kinds of things. So again, as with all rights, there are some reasonable restrictions on these rights.